Here are the leather tools and supplies I will use for making a leather hair barrette. I'm using vegetable tanned or veg tan leather that is 6 to 7 ounces. This is a good thickness for tooling and wet forming leather. First, I trace out a few light guidelines on the leather using my template. Then I line up my straight edge to cut. I always make sure my utility knife is very sharp. I apply much more pressure on the straight edge and lighter pressure on the knife. I usually make several shallow cuts, keeping the knife firmly against the straight edge. Here the knife wandered a little bit, but I'll straighten that up later. There's always that one little whisker still holding on. These are the holes for the hairpin. I can make holes with a hammer and punch, or use a drill punch. I always place a scrap piece of leather underneath when I punch holes. I use a pair of leather shears to round off the corners. A leather edger is used to clean up the edge on the grain side before I burnish. I always make sure that my fingers aren't in the way when I use this tool. The corners can be a bit tricky. I also clean up the edge on the back side or the flesh side of the leather. For thicker leather, I may also sand the edge first. I apply water just to the edge of the leather before I burnish. If I wet the entire piece of leather, it would be limp and make the burnishing process more difficult. This is a standard wooden edge slicker used to burnish the edges to make them smooth and shiny. I use a vigorous back and forth motion with gentle pressure. If I apply too much pressure, it can cause the edge of the leather to mushroom out, and it doesn't look as nice. The edge will get a smooth and glaze-like finish. Here's a comparison to the unburnished side that is still rough and ragged looking. For larger projects, I've also used a rotary tool with a burnisher attachment. I try to avoid letting gravity drip water down the leather. I personally like the traditional method of burnishing using wood or antler. Edge slicking is one of the more therapeutic parts of leatherworking. I wet the entire piece of leather before I stamp. This is called casing the leather. The leather should be damp but not sopping wet. The backside should remain relatively dry. However, the entire piece of leather should be wet to avoid water spots when it dries. I love watching water soak into the leather. Stamping leather when it's wet gives a much sharper and deeper impression. It's best to stamp on the hardest surface possible. This is a white oak stamp I will use. Today I'm doing a very basic design with only a few stamps. If I was doing a more complex design with carving and intricate tooling that takes hours, I would continue to wet the leather as I work. I left the tools in this shot for the dramatic effect of stamping. Three whacks with a rawhide mallet is usually good, but 5 makes sure the job's done. I'm also going to add an acorn stamp. My design is mostly dry, but it's still cool and damp to the touch. This is a water-based stain, so it will spread more evenly when the leather is slightly damp. I prefer my stain shaken. If I was using an oil-based stain or dye, I would make sure the leather dried overnight. I use a wool dauber to apply the stain to the edges first. Then I apply to the rest of the leather in a circular motion. I slop it on pretty good to get in all those recesses of the stamp pattern. This particular stain dries very quickly, so I have to work fast. I let this soak in for maybe 20 seconds, and then I gently rub off the excess. The beauty of the hi-lite stain is that it sticks in the stamp marks so well. It also gives the leather an almost antique look. While this is still wet, I'm going to insert the hairpin and let it dry in that dome shape. I'm almost finished. I burnish the edge very quickly one last time. The finishing touch to protect and preserve the leather is my secret weapon. Obenauf's is made from natural oils and beeswax, and it smells like honey. I apply a generous layer to my design with a scrap piece of cloth. I also apply it to the fleshy underside to protect the leather from getting wet. It will only temporarily darken the leather. Burnishing the inside helps the fleshy, fuzzy side lay down. I finish it up by buffing off any excess wax. And as always, thanks for watching.